Wesley doesn't have a voice, and so he's not here. He's got the crud. And earlier in the week, I did not have a voice. My voice is back, but I have a cough drop in. I apologize for that. Anyway, um, we're going to continue on. He asked me to continue on with Revelation chapter 17. We're going to look at that. I'm going to take about 2 minutes to tell you something, and maybe in the future I'll get to tell you more about it. I got a call yesterday from Keith Hovis. Keith is the preacher for the Lebanon Church of Christ, but we've kind of evolved into something. He's been teaching students in Tanzania for several years, one class a week, and they asked him to expand it. He talked to us, and we agreed that we would help facilitate it, and we pay for licenses for Skype and Zoom and things of that nature. And we were planning to start this in August, but as the word got out, it just started exploding. And we started in January with 10 English-speaking students in Tanzania. And within the first week, somehow students in Ghana found out about it. And these are men, for the most part, that are already preaching, but they have no training, no formal training. And the reason why they're preaching is, well, why would they do that? Because the church is exploding over there. There is a revival sweeping across Africa. It's amazing. And so they're desperate for men that are preaching. So men have stepped up. They feel the burden, and they step up, and they say, but we need training. So last quarter, we had about 14 English-speaking men. This coming quarter, we have between 18 and 20 English-speaking men. But here's what's exciting. We have 2 men in Kenya. One is John that we support. We've been helping with the well and other things, and helping support on a monthly basis, I believe. And John, and he's very articulate, well-trained. John is going to be taking the class, not so much that he needs the class, but he's going to take the class. We're going to send him the material via PDF, and he has between 8 and 10 Kenyan students who do not speak English that he's going to be teaching, preparing to preach. And we have another man in Kenya, Shadrach, who's going to be doing the same thing. So we're going to be reaching about 40 men. And I'd love to preach to you about that, because I tell you, I just say this real quickly. Have you ever thought of the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah would have stood had it been for half a dozen righteous souls? It might be that the United States of America stands because there are a few congregations like Stony Creek that say, we're going to dig in, we're going to use our influence, we're going to use our technology, we're going to use our affluence and get the gospel around the world. And so anyway, I'd love to talk to you more and more about that. But we're going to be in Revelation chapter 17. I'll have the verses up, but you may want to open your Bibles to Revelation 17. We're going to be moving at a pretty good clip. And if we have time at the end, we'll go back and we'll review some things. I just want to start with this to remind you that you have the first 7 seals. The first 6 seals really are an overview of the things that are going to be happening. And then you have the 7 trumpets, which are partial judgment, a third, a third, a third. You know, it would be pretty devastating if you turned on the TV this afternoon and you heard a ship went down in the Atlantic, and we'd say, well, that's strange. And then tomorrow you turn on and you say, well, there were 2 ships that went down in the Pacific, and then the next day another ship went down in the Atlantic. You see what I'm saying? It just over and over and over. And then here's an entire crop that's wiped out in the Midwest, and on. A third should get your attention, but we recognize it did not get their attention. As a matter of fact, in chapter 9, the point's made, they didn't repent. They're ungodly people, but they did not repent. So with the 7 trumpets, it's partial judgment. With the 7 bowls, then, that are introduced at the end of the 7 trumpets, it's complete judgment. Now, here's the point why I bring this up. I think this is really important. If you notice up there on the chart, the 7 bowls are completed in chapter 16. And you might be tempted to think, well, that complete judgment's over. Well, it is, but he's going to go back, I believe, and review some things that have happened. I'll give you an example. That's what happens in history. Now, God's writing history before it happens, but sometimes you follow something all the way out, and then you come back and say, now let's highlight some details. We have an example of that. Genesis chapter 1, we have the complete creation account. Correct? It is. It is the creation account. What happens in chapter 2? It's not a second creation account. What's he do? He goes back, he says, now let's highlight some details. Okay? But he wants you to get the big picture in chapter 1. Well, this is what's happening here. So when we come to chapter 17, it's part of that complete judgment, but now he's going to be showing us some details. And so when we come to chapter 17, I want you to notice, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. Now, if you'll keep that in mind, that's what he's called to see, the judgment of the great harlot. You'll get the reason why I'm emphasizing this here in just a moment. So, back in chapter 14, we have a little preview. The great city is fallen. So the story is in chapter 17 and 18. Today, we're looking at chapter 17. If we make enough time, we'll look at the first 3 verses of 18. Next week, Wesley will come back and deal with chapter 18. But we're going to meet the great harlot in chapter 17, and we're going to see that she's the object of coming judgment. So, verse 1, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. And so we know who the object of the judgment is right now. We don't know, the text hasn't made clear to us who this is. And as tempting as it is for me to go in and say, now the harlot is, the text is going to do that for us here in just a moment. I apologize for the cough drop. So in the following verses, we're going to get a description of the harlot. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blaspheming, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now notice the woman in verse number 4. Very important. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, and having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornications. Now what kind of person is arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls? That's regal, isn't it? But this is supposed to be a judged woman. She doesn't look judged. And you'll see there's a reason for this. And don't miss that. She doesn't look judged right now. If she was judged, you would expect her to come out. Now, she is judged, but she doesn't know it. And there's a purpose behind this. We would expect her to come out maybe in sackcloth and black garments and everything. She doesn't look judged right now, okay? Notice also, and on her forehead a name was written. And on her forehead a name was written. Well, let me see. I skipped some verses, didn't I? Okay. So she carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw the woman. Okay, I already covered that. Okay, verse number 5. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. Now this idea written on her forehead, there's some idea that maybe that's what harlots did in that day and time in Rome, that they would have, in essence, advertisement written across their head. But here's what I do know. Isn't it interesting? In the book of Revelation, there are other people who are marked. At the end of Revelation 6, at the 6th seal, there's this great cosmic disturbance that's going to happen. It's the upheaval that's going to happen when God judges Rome, and the question is asked at the end of chapter 6, who's able to stand? Chapter 7 answers that. Those who are faithful, those who are sealed, and it's 144,000, 12 representing 12 representing all those who are involved in authorized worship and service to God. You got 12 apostles. You got 12 tribes. That's the idea. You take it up to 1,000. 1,000 is completeness to the nth degree. How many cattle does God own? He owns the cattle, but what's the scripture say? The cattle on 1,000 hills is the idea of completeness to the nth degree. Okay? So 144,000, every individual who's faithful to God, he knows them, and they're marked. It's not a literal mark, obviously, but God's reassuring them, I know who you are. You might be hiding out in a catacomb, but I know who you are and I know where you are. You may get caught up in the judgment that's happening, but you're not under judgment. If you die, it's good news for you. You get to come home. But then there's another group that's marked. In chapter 13, they take the mark of the beast. These are the people, it's easier for them just to go along to get along. If you don't worship the emperor, you don't get your documentation, and you don't get to buy, and you don't get to sell. Now for us, on first glance, we think, well, just imagine if you were walking into Food City or Walmart or Ingles or any of these places, and there was a guard standing there saying, you can't come buy groceries here. You can't buy groceries here. And you'd be forced to go to the black market. So these people are the ones that go along to get along. And they go ahead and worship the emperor. So you've got those who are God's people that are marked. You've got those who are not God's people who are marked. And then you've got this woman who is marked. She's got this name written on her head. And this is how God views her. Now notice this in the first part of verse 6. And we're going to be getting down to who this woman is. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. Now, who does this give us any clue who this is right here? Drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs. This is the persecuting power of Rome. This is Rome and the persecuting power of Rome, and to a great extent the citizens that have gone along with all of this. But there's another question here. Look at the second part of verse 6. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. Now, he's not marveling with, wow, this is wonderful. What do you suppose he's marveling about? He was called to see a woman who's going to be judged. She doesn't look judged. Now, this is really important. This is a great lesson for us. The Christians in the first century needed to understand this, and we need to understand this today. God's doing something for their benefit to see this, but we have situations that come up as well. You remember the story of David and Goliath? You remember the old adage, the bigger they are? Yeah. And I love the line where David, what was the only weapon David had? Sling and stones. He said, I'm going to cut your head off. Or he said, I'm going to take your head from you. That's a ridiculous statement, isn't it? But he came down. He came down. People look at us and think, Christians are victorious? That's one of the things that's going to happen on Judgment Day. We're going to be vindicated, okay? And that's not a bad thing. Vindicated means all the world is looking at Christianity and saying, y'all are idiots. You can't feed your family. All you got to do is go curtsy in front of the image of the emperor, and you could feed your family. You're morons. We're going to be vindicated on Judgment Day. But now here's the point. Here's this woman. She doesn't look like a judge woman. And so the question is, does it pay to serve God? We sing this song, and it's a good song. I don't know that we're going to know everything in the end, but the premise of the song is good. Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long, while there are others living about us, never molested though in the wrong. Now, all of us here in this room, we're old enough that at some point in our life, We might intellectually, we might know God's going to take care of everything. But on an operational level, we look out and we think, God, why are you letting this wicked person get away with this? God, why are you... I know that wicked person is under judgment, but it doesn't look like they're under judgment. Why are you letting them get away with that? And God's, in essence, is saying, I know the right time, and I'm going to deal with this, and just like he dealt with the harlot. All right. Now let's look at the explanations concerning the beast and the harlot. The harlot rides on. We'll start in verse number 7. But the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 7 horns. So now, this is something we couldn't figure out completely unless he told us, so he's going to tell us. Verse number 8. The beast that you saw and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. And when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Now we're going to deal with that in just a moment. Do you remember back in chapter 13, we see the 3 beasts. We have the sea beast, and we have the land beast, okay? And so you have the dragon. He's not, that's Satan. But you have the dragon, you have the sea beast, and you have the land beast. The land beast is the ones who are causing people to worship the beast. And the sea beast is the persecuting power of Rome. And he talks about this beast that was and is not and yet is. Just hold on to that for a moment. He tells us the meaning of the 7 heads. Verse number 9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So this woman is sitting on 7 mountains. Now what in the world could that mean? Well, there's 7 hills in Rome, Georgia, but I doubt that Rome, Georgia would be of consideration to the 7 churches of Asia or Lynchburg, Virginia, or as Mike said, the 7 hills of Rome. Okay? And so it makes it, and in the first century, they would have got it immediately. They would have known immediately what was under consideration there. And so Rome sits on 7 hills over the swampy Tiber River. Verse number 10. Now he's going to give them, and we're going to be able to see it as well, but he's going to give them some indication. Let me give you a time frame of when this is going to happen. He's preparing them for this very difficult time of persecution. There's a temptation perhaps on their part, and you'll see this in a moment. They went through the persecution of Nero. And no one perfected cruelty any better than Nero did. Nero was a cruel, vicious, sick individual. Psychotic. Okay? And I wish I had time just to talk to you about Nero. He did some of the most bizarre things. I'm going to resist that temptation. But no one had more widespread persecution than Domitian. So there's this temptation, because I believe this is being written, and I'll show you why here. The text tells us why. After Nero is left, things are probably eased up, but he says, you need to prepare yourself. And the only way to prepare yourself, and Wesley's pointed this out, this is the message of Revelation 2 and 3. We don't know what's ahead, but I can tell you this, the only way to prepare yourself for the future, be faithful. Be faithful. Got to be faithful. Now, notice what he says in verse number 10. there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Verse number 11. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. Now, what does all that mean? Well, let's look at a little chart that I've got here. So you have 8 Roman emperors. After Nero committed suicide, and the reason why he committed suicide, he was told, the Senate sent him a note, said do the right thing, which meant commit suicide. And so he commits suicide, and there's an upheaval. There's 3 upstart generals that tried to take power, but they never consolidated power. That of the 3, none of them even really ruled for a very, very short period of time. There wasn't even a year there that they ruled. Okay? And we'll deal more with that in a moment. But now let's look at the text. So there are 5 have fallen. 5 are fallen. That means they are no more. One is, and he must continue a short time, and he is, and then, and and the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th. So you notice number 8, we're talking about Domitian here. Now I'm going to expand this a little bit. Sometimes people ask the question, matter of fact, I've had people kind of quibble, and they say, you can't make this work because there were actually the 8 plus the 3. Well, Daniel gives us a reason to ignore the 3. Over in Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, he's looking forward to this, and Daniel says, the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones. He shall subdue 3 kings. Now, so notice what he says. He, Domitian, subdue 3 kings. Now that's he gives us permission there. He says, you ignore these 3. Historians, incidentally, historians ignore these 3. I'm not aware of any historian. I'm not a scholar, but I focus somewhat on this, and I'm not aware of any historian that would consider these men emperors, okay? They wanted to be. Now, it says Domitian subdued them. I would love to have some historical evidence, and I've looked for it, that indicates that there's an idea that maybe he was responsible for their deaths. There is indication that he wanted to be emperor, but his daddy, Vespasian, says, no, it's not your turn yet, son. Vespasian comes back from the siege of Jerusalem. He lets his son Titus complete the siege of Jerusalem, and Vespasian comes back and tells Domitian, you shoo, it's not your time yet, and he becomes emperor, okay? I know this, Daniel says he subdued 3 kings, and so that makes sense. Now let's go back to chapter 17 and look at this again. So we see there are 5 kings that have fallen. Boom, boom, boom. They're gone, okay? We have no reason. Daniel tells us that we do not have to pay attention to these 3. And then he says that, and one is. Now that tells us that Vespasian is the ruler at that time. Telling them at that time, this is when you're living, all right? But it's also telling them, I'm going to give you a little time marker when this great persecution is coming. Now notice this. And the other is not yet come. The next emperor is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. Titus didn't even rule 2 years. Very short time. Isn't that interesting? You know, historically, that's just amazing. All right? Now, here's where it might get a little weird for us, but I think we can understand this. Verse 11, and the beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. Now, what is this business about? So we're talking about Domitian. You're going to be facing persecution under Domitian. You might be tempted in that time to think, whew, Nero's gone, things have eased up. No, they're hard times are coming. And he doesn't tell them Domitian. They don't know who. They don't know for sure it's going to be Vespasian's son, but there's going to, when Vespasian's gone, you better watch up, because the next one's not going to be emperor very long. And the only way to prepare is to be faithful. Now let's talk about this idea of was, is not, and yet is. Okay? There was, I'm gonna go forward for a minute and then we'll go back. There was a myth in the first century. The Christians didn't believe it. John didn't believe it. And the Holy Spirit didn't believe it. But I believe John played on that myth. And the myth was Nero's coming back. Either he didn't really die, or he's going to be revived, or he's going to be reincarnated, or somehow Nero's going to come back. And I think there's also some clues of reassurance in the text of Revelation, even though Christians wouldn't believe it. Can you imagine how irritating and be just like sandpaper all the time if you hear people in the community, you know Nero's coming back. Nero's coming back. You don't have to hear it all the time. And just begin. And John says that Jesus is the one who was and is to be. And he says that over and over and over again. It's as if he's telling the Christians, I know you don't have to worry about Nero coming back. But let me tell you who the eternal one is. But there's this idea out there. And so John kind of uses this, I believe, and other commentators do as well, as a device to help them understand this thing. So let's go back. So he talks about the idea, let's see here. So he talks about, where do I want to pick up? We'll start with it. And verse number 8. We'll just read the whole verse here. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. The beast that was, Nero, past tense. Okay? He is no longer in existence. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life. Why will they marvel? They'll marvel because they don't get it. They don't get what we get. They don't have inspiration to help them understand God's in control. You know, they're thinking Nero will never go down. And matter of fact, there's going to be some other issues in the future regarding, we're going to be reading about Rome going down. This is never going to happen. Oh yeah, it'll happen. It'll happen. All right. When they see the beast that was and is not. Isn't that interesting? Nero's not anymore. And yet he is. Domitian. Now this explanation helps them understand the beast, that persecuting power. Yeah, I know it's gone. It's not, but it's going to be. Not the individual, but the persecuting power. Does that make sense? Okay. So, again, let me just say this, because there's some really good scholars that get really upset about this, the Nero redivivus myth. The Holy Spirit didn't believe it. John didn't believe it. Early Christians didn't believe it. But they capitalized on, I believe, on that idea of being out there, and they said, you're hearing this all the time, and I think it fits perfectly. At least it fits with the idea the persecuting power is gone, but it's coming back. Let's see. When do we shut down? Oh, I'm doing fabulous then. Any questions or comments? All right, let's look at verse number 12. And that we're going to talk about the 10 horns and their meaning. So, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdoms as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. I take this to be the idea of vassal kings, and Rome did this, and you're familiar, if you studied the feudal system, there would be the one who was in charge of a manor. He was given authority over that, but he had to answer to the king of England. These are vassal kings that they don't really have anything, but they've got a little bit of authority. But notice he says in verse number 13, these are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. Whatever the beast wants, that's what they're going to do. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. So in other words, they're going to join in whatever the beast says. These vassal kings over little territories, they'll do whatever the king says. You say that a person living in Smyrna cannot buy or sell unless they have documentation that they worship the emperor. You got it. You got it. All right? So these will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. How are you going to beat a king? How are you going to beat a group of kings? Well, our leader is the King of kings. He's over them. All right? And those who are with him are called chosen and faithful. And so here's another picture of us being victorious. Last week, Wesley made the point about the War of Armageddon and the picture that we see in chapter 19, the Great War. If you blink your eyes, you miss it. Because, I mean, it's just a foregone conclusion. There was a great war in heaven. It's over. It's a foregone conclusion. Now, we don't see it that way because we're locked into time and space, and it just, goes on and on. But it's like, we've won, and God's going to win. We're going to be victorious. Ultimately, God will be glorified, and that's what it's all about. So let's talk about the fate and the identity of the harlot in verse 15 through 18. The meaning of the waters that she sits on. Verse number 15. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So this woman, this persecuting power, is ruling over people. All right, Rome, we oftentimes say, and correctly so, ruled the world at that time. All right, with perhaps a few exceptions, but they were the world ruling power. And then notice the fate of the harlot in verse 16 and 17. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. What's going to happen there? These kings that were colluding with Rome, they're going to turn their back on Rome. And, this is, I think, a story that's repeated over and over again. You see it sometimes on an individual basis. You see it sometimes on a national level. People think they have a symbiotic relationship, and everybody's good and happy and friendly and everything, until what? One person's not giving. You have a nation over here. We'll give you X, cheap labor. I don't want to get into anything political. We're going to give you cheap labor. Then all of a sudden, when that doesn't happen, or we're going to give you this support or something. As soon as that's over, all of a sudden the friendship's over. Okay, you see the point here. So, verse number 17, the architect of the fate. Why does this happen? Verse 17, for God has put it into their hearts to fulfill His purpose. Now this goes along with what Joey was talking about recently regarding providence. I just know God did it. God did it. I know a few things. I know God does not make us do anything against our will. But it's just like Acts 22 and 23. He used lawless hands to crucify Jesus. He did not need them. He could have got the job done without them. But God from heaven looks up there and says, oh, that's what they're going to be? I'll just use them to get my job done. Well, here in this instance, God said, I'll use them to help fulfill my purpose. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill His purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. Then verse number 18. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now that should nail it down, shouldn't it? Who's that? That's Rome. That's Rome. There's no missing that. All right? So that's who the woman is right there. Now I'm not going to get into Wesley's territory really, but ignore the chapter division for just a moment, and we will, I didn't pull up 18. I'm really bad about not keeping up with my slides. But ignore the chapter division. That's put there for our convenience. Chapter 18 really kind of continues this discussion, and Wesley will pick up with it next week. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. So what's he saying here? It's over for Rome. When Domitian, now it's a little bit hard for us to comprehend this, because the fall of Rome, as we think about it from a historical standpoint, the fall of Rome lasted longer than many nations last. Okay? But when Domitian ended, that was the end of her glory. All right? I think Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, he talks about, the horrible, and you think about it, he says, prison for every foul spirit and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. Marcus Aurelius talks about the immorality, the rampant immorality, and how it was just so horrible. It was just a horrible place. And not that there wasn't immorality before that, but now it's just increased, and there's nothing good there, and they have no power. So at the fall, compared to what they did have. And so at the fall of Domitian, there's a dramatic change, and I believe that's the point that we'll see later on in 20 and 21 when he talks about a new heaven and a new earth. It's a whole new situation for them, okay? It's like a whole new universe for them. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. That was the case in the first century. Now, Wesley, if you're listening, I've not taught chapter 18. You have chapter 18 for next week. But you see the idea here. The persecuting power of Rome is over. And Rome is on its way out. Now, we may start with a review, but I'll open it up for a few questions, but I want to start with a comment. This has to do with the literal 7 churches of Asia in the first century. However, there's some great lessons here for us. Have you ever heard someone say, or perhaps thought, well, we're the United States of America. We'll never fall. We have the greatest military in the world. We have the greatest economy in the world, and we have the greatest technology in the world, and on and on and on. And we'll never fall. Is there a lesson here for us? That's exactly right, Don. That's exactly right. It all comes down to the fact, if God says, I've had enough, it's over. And this gets a little bit back to what I was saying at the beginning of the class. It may be because of a few congregations, and don't misunderstand me. I think there are a lot of faithful congregations here in the United States of America. But it might be that God looks down and sees a few faithful congregations like Stony Creek. Oh, you are trying to get the gospel into Kenya and help those people spread the gospel and sending your money to help them be able to eat and live and spread the gospel. Oh, you're trying to train men to preach the gospel. Oh, you're trying to evangelize through this method or that method. I'm gonna keep things going. And I tell you, it really motivates me to, I'm not after your money, I promise I'm not. But it really does motivate me to think, We need to use our wealth. Bill Haywood needs to use his wealth. You might be wondering, he's wealthy? Every one of us in this room is wealthy. Every one of us in this room is wealthy. And we need to use our wealth to spread the gospel, promote purity, and realize that's what this messed up world needs is the gospel. I'm going to stop preaching. Comments, questions before the bell rings. You look like you had a comment.
I was just thinking about a point you made a while ago. The Huns set up on the border of the empire, and Attila was their leader, and they beat the legion. And Rome courted Attila. They brought him into the courts, and I think there was even a love interest, but he was wined and dined. They tried to make friends with him, but ultimately him and the other hordes invaded. And all of this is prophesied right here.
Yeah.
They brought the empire down.
You know, it's amazing because Rome had one core value: preserve Rome. That was it. That's what emperor worship was about. They had no core value, whereas this is the beautiful thing about the United States of America. You can debate, and it all depends on how you define it. Was the United States of America a Christian nation? Well, I don't think there can be any denying that for many years there was a Christian consensus. I teach worldviews, and I argue that unfortunately there was a time in the last century where the Christian consensus remained. In other words, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, don't fornicate, those sorts of things. That was the Christian consensus. You might have somebody living next to you that didn't go to worship, that they didn't care anything about that, but they still believed you shouldn't lie, and they believed in the golden rule, and they believed in that kind of stuff. That makes for a better nation. Righteousness exalts a nation. And when you don't have that as a core value, you're corrupt. The reason why Rome had emperor worship was for the purpose of unity. Do you remember after September 11, 2001, really kind of began to burn me up. All the billboards about unity, we need to be unified. Of course, for them, unity means I need to hold hands with a Muslim and say, you're good, and I need to hold hands with this person and say, you're good. If we mean, because you remember the prayer service they had on that Saturday following September 2011? They had a Muslim, and they had maybe even a Hindu, and oh yeah, we'll throw a Christian in there too. United States is getting to the point we have no core value as a nation. So anyway, all right. Wesley will clean it all up next week.